the end of the day, what we'll see, whoever wins the election, is that America will still have, for European eyes certainly, substantial degrees of inequality. And America will continue to seem like an unequal society. But for Americans, how equality and inequality is defined is in important ways different than in the European context. And that's the nature of American political culture. For Americans, access is more important than defining equality in terms of outcomes. And that will continue to be the case. And you hear that in the narratives of both Romney and Obama, and how they try to deal with notions of decline and inequality. The last component of sort of a broader context for thinking about decline and exceptionalism that we see historically and we see today are notions of tolerance and mobility. And I want to talk a little bit about that. Another indicator that Americans talk about and the international community talks about in terms of notions of American decline, the loss of exceptionalism, is the growing intolerance in American society. And there's certainly lots of evidence for that. We see it, as a matter of fact, globally, among post-industrial societies, whether it's rising anti-Semitism in Europe, rising anti-foreigner sentiment in Russia, forms of hyper-nationalism in China, anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim sentiment in the United States, and other forms of xenophobia and intolerance. So there's clear evidence that this is to be found throughout American society. This growing, if you will, intolerance to an important degree. We see this including violence, vigilantism, forms of xenophobia across the country. Again, in the earlier periods of American history, we've seen, especially during periods of economic turbulence, such anti-foreigner sentiment on the rise, starting with the American Protection Association in the 1880s, and really a widespread anti-foreigner movement in the latter 19th century. The 1920s, the rise even in much more physical violence, the surge in lynchings by the Ku Klux Klan, and also anti-immigrant sentiment, such as the National Origins Act, 1924. And perhaps you can say, depending on how you want to read it, the Patriot Act was a type of act of intolerance and anti-foreigner sentiment. At the same time, if you look at American society, you can also see what you saw in those earlier periods, which is widespread change taking place in terms of diversity. The United States currently has the largest Muslim middle class in the world, still, depending on how Indonesia develops. 1 million new immigrants quasi per year coming into the country, rates of immigration we haven't seen for almost a century. And the United States will likely be the first post-industrial society to become a majority-minority country. Bad news for the Republicans of today, good news for the Democrats of today. So this profound dynamism unleashes, of course, societal reactions, but the trend is clear and will continue. Polls show quite clearly that Americans are more tolerant today than in any other period in the country's history. Tolerant per se? Of course not. Racism still plays a clear role in American politics, whether it be a white voter looking at a black politician, or a Latino voter looking at a black politician, or an Asian American voter perceiving a Latino politician. Racism has diversified in American society and how it plays a role. But historically and broadly, America is becoming a more tolerant society. You can see that concretely in President Obama's being able to remove don't ask, don't tell from military careers, where Clinton could not do that just a generation ago. So what does this all mean? It means in the current political season, looking at America's debate about exceptionalism and declinism, we see elements that we've seen before, the 1880s, the 1930s, and the 1960s. But in the broad context of the last, say, century and a half of American political history, I would say overall, the debate today about exceptionalism and declinism is structured by more tolerance, more total wealth in the society, and more mobility, and of course higher expectations than we've seen in earlier periods. So let's look at the global constellation of American power. Any discussion of exceptionalism and declinism has to look at sort of the ecosystem, if you will, in which we're having this conversation. It can't be an isolated debate. The first very important element is that overall, as I mentioned earlier, the US economy is on the mend, slowly, but the evidence is increasingly solid that it is. And the general consensus is whoever wins the election, Romney or Obama, if Obama wins, he's going to be able to take credit for a lot of this, rightfully so. If Romney wins, he's going to take credit for the growing economic recovery. So he's mentioned in his debates, if I become president, I'll create 12 million new jobs. Well, away from the political scene, experts are estimating once the economy begins to really recover, begins to create around 200,000 new jobs a month, you multiply that 12 months per year, 4 years, it's about 12 million jobs without him really doing anything. So it sounds like a big, bold number. So the important thing is that overall, the economy is on the mend. And with this, of course, social costs will decline, tax income will go up, the country's overall budget situation will improve slightly, as will people's confidence. Now, a lot of this depends, of course, on the congressional elections. I'm not going to get into that a lot right here, but what I do want to say is that no matter what happens, of course I'm just predicting, I can be completely wrong. But if anyone's had a chance to look at Bob Woodward, the journalist from the Washington Post, in his book that came out this year called The Price of Politics, he points out that for the Tea Party, and the Tea Party faction among the Republicans, life is getting increasingly uncomfortable. And that the moderates in the Republican Party, John Boehmer, for example, the majority leader in the House, basically had a deal done with Barack Obama, the president, in terms of revenue and cuts, long-term structural reform of the budget politics. And it was really the Tea Party faction in the House that torpedoed that. At a very high price. Sort of the national opinion of the Tea Party and what it meant for national politics plummeted. Even the Wall Street Journal was critical. That got Eric Cantor from Virginia's attention. So I don't want to sound too optimistic, but we're going to have this so-called fiscal cliff on January 1st, 2013, 2 months from now, essentially, where automatic tax raises and automatic cuts come into place. And the general consensus is this is going to really focus the Republicans in Congress and, more than anything, encourage them to reach the so-called grand bargain for American long-term debt reduction and social spending. We will see. That could be easily overly optimistic. But eventually a deal will be made. And between the US economy mending and the long-term budget deal being made, this will overall lead to America's financial house slowly coming into order. The other global constellation issue that's very important, I think, is we're seeing that the rise of the so-called BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, is not a linear development. It's actually much more complex than we like to think. India is beginning to experience what rising wealth means for its social contract, and how complex that is, going through profound tensions and transformations. Brazil, similarly, exploding inequality in the Brazilian model, and what that means for Brazilian society. Russia and its slew of profound issues that it needs to solve. So this sort of inevitability of the rise of the BRICS and the emergence of a multipolar world is, for my take at least, too linear, too quick, too simple. We're seeing indeed that the rise of wealth and the rise of power brings whole sets of new issues and challenges for societies that they can manage or they might not manage. We see this particularly with China. So the idea that China is going to be the new superpower, the new sort of singular power overtaking the United States based on economic performance, it certainly has a rapidly growing economy. It also has on its own profound problems. All of a sudden, the New York Times is a national security threat for China. And that speaks volumes about the fragility, actually, of the Chinese model. People are beginning to compare China to Japan in the 1980s, when Japan was the new Asian power that was going to overtake the United States. You remember Japan and the United States looked at American decadence in the 1980s. I don't know if you remember going back that far. Looking at American decline, we had Paul Kennedy's The Rise and Fall of Great Powers coming out in 1989, predicting the long-term decline of the United States. And Japanese elites looked openly with disdain at the American model of power and social cohesion. We know what's happened to Japan since then. Profound issues, profound domestic issues. in terms of transparency, elite access, the restricted room for political mobility. China has promised not to repeat Japan's mistakes. We will see. But there's early indications that China is facing similar mistakes, similar challenges, and doesn't necessarily have the tools with which to confront them. So the inevitable rise of China and Chinese power is at minimum a question mark. Add to that the changing nature of power in the Pacific region, and the fact that, except for the People's Republic of China in North Korea, every other state around mainland China wants to see more of an American presence in the region. In Japan, I think this is a nice statistic, gives you a sense of the fundamental difference between Germany's place in the world and Japan's place in the world. 85% of the Japanese welcome an increased American military presence in their country. 85%. They look at the world differently. The world is different for the Japanese than for Germany. Germany has the blessings of a certain geography that Japan does not have. At least that's how the Japanese people see it, but everyone wants to think about that. Vietnam has invited the American Navy into Cam Ranh Bay. Myanmar is even opening up, not because they love the United States, but they're worried about Chinese influence in their country and how that's going to extend, and want to know how to balance that. So, in terms of the global constellation of American power, economic issues we have, you see what's happening to rising great powers. I'd like to talk about Europe a little bit. Is America turning away from Europe? It is in part, but not because it's lost interest. The issue is really not either or. It's about relative deployment of resources. Germany is relearning to be a great power. Americans welcome that. They see that as a stabilizing force for Europe. So, and America is not forgetting Europe or abandoning Europe, but as I point out, redeploying resources from a regional economy. You have to think about this. This is the numbers that the Americans hear. Europe, the EU, has an economy roughly the size of $15 trillion. $15 billion. The American economy is about $16 billion. And Europe, EU, Europe, has around 500 million citizens. So America looks at this $15 trillion economy, 500 million free citizens in the EU-European space, and asks themselves again, why are we paying 75% of NATO's costs? So not that the Americans want to leave NATO, but they do ask themselves, and will increasingly ask themselves, that number shouldn't be 75%, that number should be 35%, just to grab a number out of the air. So in short, America expects more from Europe, and in important ways, my prediction would be over the next 10 years, we're going to see Europe doesn't really have much choice there. The US is going to deploy less resources in Europe as it turns more to the Pacific, not forgetting Europe, but expecting more from Europe. There's a difference there. And for me personally, I think this is a great moment for Europe and the young people in the crowd to debate what you are willing to do for your own security, what you want to understand as security. It might not be the same definition as the United States. But that's a debate then that will come increasingly to focus. So if you look at all these different elements in the global constellation of American power and the debate about exceptionalism and declinism, I think what you see is that overall, in the debate about exceptionalism and declinism, compared to past empires, whether it be the Soviet or the British or the French or the Dutch or Roman empires, is a different debate. In part because of America's ability to regenerate its own power, I'll come to that in a second. Because of the relative difficulties being encountered by rising powers, I would suggest. And lastly, by the sustained invitation to empire being extended to America, especially in the Pacific region. We haven't seen that before in that degree with earlier empires. That component that was important for Europe after World War II and is no longer important for Europe is actually of growing importance in the Pacific region. Now, America will naturally need to adjust the exercise of power in the coming years. And this will happen under Romney or Obama. But it will experience that, but the United States will experience that it still has potent amounts of power to influence global politics. We come to that, the last component of my argument, why I think America is going to remain powerful. I'm not saying that's something I like, or that's something necessarily that we need, but I'm asking myself, will America remain a global power, yes or no, and if it is, under what conditions or why?